The year was 1821. In a quiet, forgotten corner of Europe, a village lay hidden among dark forests and mist-covered marshes. Life there was simple, bound by faith, superstition, and the unshakable rhythm of survival. But in that same year, history would take a darker turn, one that has remained shrouded in eerie details, whispered only in the shadows of old church walls and in fragments of forgotten journals. It began with a child, a boy no older than 8, pale and wide-eyed, who one morning began to speak in a language no one had ever heard before. At first, the villagers thought it was childish nonsense, the babbling of a restless mind. But as days passed, the words grew sharper, deliberate, and terrifyingly fluent. The boy spoke with a conviction that unsettled everyone who heard it. The old men muttered about forbidden language. The women crossed themselves when he passed, and the children whispered behind their hands that he was not one of them. This was not just a strange event. This was the beginning of an unsolved mystery, one that would haunt the village for generations. Imagine the scene. An old photograph, cracked and faded, shows a row of villagers standing stiffly outside their church. In the center, the small boy stares into the lens. His eyes are hollow, his lips slightly parted as though frozen mid-word. Look closely at the photograph. The adults stand solemn, but it is the child who draws your gaze. Even through the grain of age, something feels wrong. It is as though he knows you are watching. Though photography in 1821 was still in its earliest, experimental form, there are claims that several post-mortem photographs of the boy were taken in the years that followed. Disturbing images that historians have tried to dismiss as fabrications, yet their existence lingers in archives, labeled under forgotten events. To look at them is to feel the pull of a chilling secret. A child captured not in death, but in moments of uncanny silence, as though the camera itself feared to record his words. The villagers were terrified. In a time when strange illnesses and unexplained deaths were blamed on curses or demons, the idea of a child speaking in an unknown tongue was unthinkable. Priests warned that the language was a trick of the devil. Mothers held their children close, terrified that the boy's words might carry some kind of sickness of the soul. The boy's own family, simple farmers, looked at him with unease. He was their blood, but there were nights when they swore they could not recognize him. Rumors spread quickly. They whispered that when he spoke, candles flickered, that animals avoided him, that he sometimes woke in the middle of the night, speaking the same words into the darkness, as if answering to someone who was not there. His voice was said to echo strangely, carrying through the narrow streets long after he had fallen silent. The village, already steeped in unsettling history, now had a new terror to add to its legacy. There are surviving fragments of journals from the parish priest, Father Matthew, who first recorded the boy's speech. His handwriting is jagged, rushed, as though his hands trembled while writing. He described the words as fluid, rhythmic, and older than Latin, older than the scriptures themselves. He warned that hearing the boy's voice made him dream of shadowed figures watching from the edge of his bed. "I do not believe this is the language of men," he wrote, "but of something that was here before us." The story of the boy soon became more than local gossip. Travelers passing through carried tales of a vanished child who spoke in a voice not his own. They claimed he was a harbinger of death. Others insisted he was blessed, chosen to carry a message long forgotten. But as weeks turned to months, the mystery deepened. The boy began to draw symbols in the dirt, strange, spiraling marks that no one could identify. They did not match any known alphabet, yet they carried the same eerie conviction as his voice. Scholars would later compare them to fragments of proto-writing, inscriptions lost in time, older than recorded civilization. Look again at the old photograph. At first glance it seems ordinary, but hidden in the shadows is something sinister. A hand rests on the boy's shoulder, but whose hand is it? The villagers all claimed it was not theirs. The shape is thin, elongated, too pale. Some say it was a flaw of exposure. Others insist it was proof that the boy was never alone, that something unseen stood beside him, guiding his tongue. The villagers wanted answers, but the truth only slipped further from their grasp. And with every passing day, the boy seemed less like a child and more like a vessel, an empty shell filled with words that should never have been spoken aloud. His laughter grew rare, his eyes distant, and his voice became sharper, almost commanding, as though the forbidden language was not just being spoken, but remembered. This is how it began. The mysterious disappearance of innocence. The unsettling history of a boy who spoke a language that should not exist, and the hidden truth that even now remains lost in time. But this was only the beginning, because soon the boy's words would call forth events that no one in the village could explain or forget. The village had always been quiet. Nestled between dense forests and endless fields of marsh, it seemed lost in time. Its people lived in small wooden homes, roofs sagging under the weight of years, windows clouded with dust. They lived by the church bells, by the rise of the sun, and by the prayers whispered at night to keep evil away. But after 1821, nothing was ordinary anymore. At first, they tried to dismiss the boy's strange words. Children had always been prone to nonsense. Yet this was different. This language was not playful, not random. It had weight, and it filled the air like smoke. The women at the well said the sound lingered in their ears long after he had passed. The farmers muttered that even the cattle grew restless when he spoke, their eyes rolling white, refusing to eat. Slowly, the village itself began to change. The quiet was no longer peaceful, it was uneasy. Look closely at one of the few old photos believed to show this place. A group of villagers stand in front of their cottages, faces stern, eyes shadowed. The boy is not there, but the expressions tell the story. Fear had already taken root. Some hold their children close, others avert their gaze from the camera as though refusing to be recorded in that cursed moment. Historians say the photo is simply a village portrait. But when you study it, you notice unsettling history etched in every stare. This was no ordinary village, and they knew it. Rumors grew quickly. Some whispered the boy had been touched by God. Others swore he was cursed, chosen to carry a forbidden language. They said he had been marked at birth, though no one could remember seeing anything unusual until that year. The family, poor, weary farmers, could not escape the gossip. Neighbors avoided them. Food was left on their doorstep not out of kindness, but out of fear. Few dared to step inside their home, and those who did claim the air felt colder, as if an unseen presence was watching. One account speaks of a woman named Eliza, a midwife who had delivered half the village's children. She swore that when the boy looked at her, she could no longer remember her own prayers. "It was as if his words had stolen them from me," she said in her later years, her voice trembling. Eliza claimed her sleep was plagued by visions. Vanished children wandering the woods, their mouths moving silently in the same impossible tongue. These stories may sound like superstition, but to the villagers, they were proof of a hidden truth. Something sinister had entered their lives, and it wore the face of a child. By the end of summer, the boy's language became impossible to ignore. He would sit by the edge of the marsh, muttering phrases that no one understood. Sometimes he spoke softly, almost tenderly. Other times his voice rose in strange cadences that carried across the water. The villagers began to hear echoes, not only his words, but faint replies coming from the woods. Fathers warned their children never to wander too close, but some disobeyed, and those who did swore they saw figures standing among the trees, tall, thin silhouettes, still as statues. Watching, the fear crept into every corner. The church, once the heart of the village, now felt heavy with dread. Father Matthew tried to calm his congregation, but even he could not deny the strangeness. He had begun recording the boy's words in his journal, and though he told no one, his dreams grew darker. He dreamt of strange families gathered in candlelit rooms, chanting in the same tongue. He dreamt of post-mortem photography, of dead children whose glassy eyes seemed to mouth the same words as the boy. The villagers did not know of his dreams, but they sensed the same weight pressing on their souls. One evening, an unsettling event drove their unease deeper. The gathering was held at the blacksmith's home. Villagers crowded into the dim, Smoky room, voices low, candles flickering. The boy was brought in, his mother clutching his hand, her face pale. They asked him to speak, and he did. What poured from his mouth was not babble, not random sound. It was structured, clear, the rhythm of language. Yet no one recognized it. His voice carried an authority far too heavy for a child. Some said they saw the iron tools on the blacksmith's wall tremble. Others swore the flames in the forge dimmed. The blacksmith's wife fainted where she stood. When the boy finally fell silent, no one dared move. Look closely at another disturbing image said to capture this moment. The room is grainy, shadowed. The boy sits in the center, his lips slightly open. But it is the faces of those around him that freeze your blood. Their expressions are not of curiosity, but of fear. Wide eyes, clenched jaws, as though something unspeakable had just passed through the room. Some historians dismiss the photograph as fabricated. Yet for those who believe, it is evidence of a night when horror storytelling became reality, when a village confronted the chilling secrets of a boy who should never have existed. From that night onward, life in the village was different. No one laughed in the streets. No one lingered outside after dark. The boy had become a mystery no one could explain, a threat no one could name. And soon, what began as whispers of unease would turn to open fear and violence. The village whispers soon grew into fearful confessions. Everyone had heard the boy speak at least once, but not everyone admitted it. Some kept their silence, afraid that even repeating his words might invite a curse. But the first witnesses, those who heard the language directly, when no one else was around, left behind testimonies that still unsettle historians today. It began with a farmer. He worked the fields before dawn, the mist rolling low across the marsh. He claimed he saw the boy standing among the stalks of wheat, alone, lips moving. The farmer thought the child was singing to himself. But as he drew closer, he heard it, the strange rhythm, the alien fluency, a forbidden language spilling effortlessly from the mouth of a child who should have known only the simple dialect of the village. The farmer froze. He swore the words carried weight, vibrating in the air like the tolling of a bell. His plow horse screamed, broke free of its harness, and fled into the trees. Terrified, the farmer staggered back to his home. His hands shook so badly that he spilled the lantern oil. His wife later wrote in her diary that he never entered the fields alone again. Another account came from the boy's mother. She claimed that one night, she heard him speaking in his sleep. At first, she thought he was whispering prayers. Children often mimic the rhythms of church hymns. But when she bent close, she realized the words were not prayers. They were something else. The candles in the room flickered. The shadows on the wall shifted unnaturally. And then, she swore, her son's voice changed. It deepened, as though someone else was speaking through him. She covered his mouth in panic, but the voice did not stop. The sound seemed to pour from the very air itself. By morning, she was pale and trembling. Her neighbors said she had aged years in a single night. Then came Father Matthew. The priest demanded the boy recite the Lord's Prayer during a gathering at the chapel. The boy folded his hands, bowed his head, and began to speak. But it was not Latin. It was not the village tongue. The words that came from his mouth echoed through the small stone chapel, cold and hollow. Some claimed the crucifix on the wall rattled. Others swore the air itself grew heavy, pressing on their chests until they could hardly breathe. The priest, shaken, tried to shout over him, but his voice faltered. The boy's words drowned him out, filling the space like an unholy hymn. Witnesses later said that the villagers who were present left the chapel in silence. No one dared speak of what they had heard. But that silence carried its own message. They had witnessed something not of this world. Look closely at a surviving old photograph of that chapel. The image is cracked, faded, nearly erased by time. Yet in the corner, near the altar, there is a blur, a shape that does not match the stone, nor the light of the window. Some claim it is a flaw of exposure. Others believe it is a figure, tall, watching, a sinister past imprinted on fragile glass. Historians file it under disturbing images, a curiosity with no clear explanation. But those who have stared too long at the photograph describe the same eerie detail. The blur seems to have eyes. Soon, the first witnesses began to change. The farmer who had heard the boy in the field spoke less and less. His wife claimed he sometimes muttered strange phrases in his sleep, echoes of the same language. The boy's mother withdrew from the community, ashamed and terrified. The priest grew restless, scribbling frantic notes in his journal, convinced he had discovered an unsolved mystery, an ancient tongue, older than scripture, perhaps even the first words of mankind. But with fascination came dread. Father Matthew's handwriting deteriorated as his obsession deepened. In one entry he wrote, "When he speaks, I feel it in my bones. This is no child's invention. This is memory. A memory too old to belong to manual." The villagers began to avoid the boy entirely. Children were pulled away when he approached. Doors closed when he passed. He wandered the muddy streets in silence, but they swore they could hear whispers follow him. At night, mothers told their children not to listen if they ever heard his voice outside their window. "Keep your ears shut," they said, "or you will vanish like the others." And here lies one of the most chilling secrets. Several families later claimed their children began to disappear. A boy gone missing from his bed, a girl vanishing in the woods, never found. No one dared accuse the strange child outright, but the timing was too sinister. In a place already steeped in unsettling history, the villagers began to wonder if his words were not just language, but summons. One post-mortem photograph surfaced years later, labeled with the name of a vanished child. The body lies still, eyes closed, dressed in Sunday clothes. But near the corner of the photo, in faint shadow, a small hand seems to press against the frame. Too thin, too pale. The resemblance to the boy is unmistakable. Most dismiss it as illusion. But for those who believe, it is proof that the boy was never alone. The first witnesses had seen too much, heard too much. Their testimonies were riddled with fear, guilt, and silence. But the more they tried to bury the truth, the more the boy's presence spread through the village like a sickness. What none of them knew, what none of them dared imagine, was that the worst was yet to come. For the boy's strange words were not fading. They were growing stronger. And soon, he would not be the only one speaking them. The boy's words were no longer whispers. They had become a presence. A sound that lingered in the air long after his lips closed. A sound that unsettled the strongest men and silenced the bravest women. The villagers began to call it the language of shadows. No one could explain it. No one could trace it. It was a tongue that belonged to no map, no book, no scripture. Yet the boy spoke it fluently, as though he had carried it with him from the moment of his birth. Father Matthew devoted himself to studying the boy's speech. His journal became filled with jagged lines, strange phonetic markings, and fevered sketches of symbols. He began to write at night, by candlelight, until his hands cramped and his eyes burned. But the more he wrote, the more the language began to change him. In one surviving page, preserved in brittle ink, he confessed, "The words are not learned. They are remembered." He speaks as if he has lived before, as if he recalls the tongue of an age long dead. "When I listen, I feel as though I too am remembering, but they are not my memories." The boy drew symbols. At first, they were crude scratches in the dirt, circles, spirals, jagged lines, but they grew more elaborate. Soon he carved them into wood, into stone, into the walls of his family's home. Look closely at one surviving disturbing image. A faded photograph from the late 1800s, discovered in the parish archives. It shows a wall inside the abandoned farmhouse where the boy once lived. Faint carvings run along the boards, curling like vines, unnatural and deliberate. At first glance, they seem like scratches. But look longer, and you see structure, a pattern. Some even believe they resemble fragments of proto-writing, scripts older than Babylon, languages buried beneath the ruins of history. This was no child's idle game. It was a message. But from whom? Or to whom? The villagers grew more fearful with each passing day. They claimed that when the boy carved his symbols, they heard whispers echoing through the trees. That when he spoke, their shadows flickered unnaturally on the walls. One mother swore that after her child heard the language, he began repeating fragments in his sleep. Days later, he vanished. Vanished children became the darkest whisper of all. Families claimed their little ones wandered too close to the boy, only to disappear without a trace. Some swore they had seen them afterward, at the edge of the woods, standing still among the trees, lips moving silently in the same forbidden language. But when they ran closer, the children were gone. The mystery of the language drew outsiders too. A wandering scholar who passed through the village claimed the boy's words resembled fragments of Greek, though twisted, distorted. Another compared them to Arabic, though they carried none of its rhythm. None could identify it. None dared to stay. And yet, the priest remained obsessed. He filled page after page, convinced he was unraveling a hidden truth. In one chilling entry he wrote, "It is not a new tongue, but the first. The tongue spoken before Babel, the voice of man when he still walked with shadows." He began to hear the words in his dreams, sometimes whispered by the boy, sometimes spoken by his own voice. He confessed that he no longer knew which was real. The boy himself claimed the words came from dreams. He told his mother that when he closed his eyes, they spoke to him. Who they were, he could not explain, but he described them as tall, faceless figures who stood in circles around him, waiting for him to speak. One night, his mother found him crouched on the floor, scratching the symbols into the dirt. His lips moved in silence. When she touched his shoulder, he turned to her with eyes she swore were not his own, dark, sunken, almost hollow. Look again at another old photograph. This one shows the boy's crude carvings preserved on a wooden door long after his disappearance. The photo seems ordinary until your eyes catch the corner. A small figure, blurred, half-faded, stands near the frame. Some claim it is simply a trick of light. Others believe it is the boy himself, captured years after he should have been gone, a haunted place frozen in grainy black and white. The language spread through the village like a plague of sound. The priest's journal suggests more and more people began to hear it, not only from the boy, but from the woods, from the marsh, even from the echoes inside their homes. It was as if the language itself was alive, feeding, seeping into the cracks of their lives. Soon, the villagers began to fear silence itself. For in silence, they swore, they could hear faint echoes of the boy's words, calling them to listen. The language was no longer his alone. It was becoming theirs. And with each new witness, with each new carving, the sinister past of the village grew darker, heavier, as though the weight of forgotten centuries had returned to claim them. The priest began to question not what the boy was saying, but what he was summoning. The village could no longer ignore him. What began as unease had grown into something darker. Fear was everywhere, etched into the lines of tired faces, whispered in trembling voices, carried like a curse through the narrow dirt paths of the settlement. But fear has a strange way of changing people. It does not always drive them away. Sometimes, it pulls them closer. And soon, the boy was no longer just feared. He was studied, followed, even worshipped. By the autumn of 1821, the villagers were divided. Some believed the boy was cursed, his voice carrying a sickness that poisoned everything it touched. They crossed themselves when he walked past, muttered prayers under their breath, and refused to meet his gaze. Others, however, became drawn to him. They whispered that his words carried power, power to heal, power to bless, power to protect. The boy's strange language was no longer just an unsolved mystery. It was becoming something more, a source of obsession. There were rumors of miracles. A farmer claimed his crops had grown taller after the boy wandered through his field, murmuring in his forbidden tongue. A shepherd said his flock, once restless and wild, became calm at the boy's touch. And yet, there were darker stories. A woman swore her infant fell ill after the boy spoke near her window. Another insisted her husband went blind after hearing his words too closely. The village doctor, powerless to explain, called it coincidence. But the villagers called it punishment. Look closely at one surviving old photo from the region. At first glance, it seems to show a family seated stiffly in front of their cottage. But study the image carefully. At the center sits the mother, her eyes dark and hollow, her infant swaddled tightly. And behind them, half hidden in the shadows of the doorway, stands a small figure. His face is blurred, his outline faint. Some say it is nothing more than damage to the photograph. Others believe it was the boy himself, caught silently watching. For those who believe, it is a disturbing image, proof of the way he lingered, always near, always watching. The boy's family, weary and broken, could not bear the attention. Their home became a place of dread, a haunted place where neighbors refused to enter. Food was left on their doorstep, offerings not of kindness, but of fear. By night, they swore they heard footsteps pacing outside their walls. By day, they found strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols that matched the boy's drawings, though none of them admitted to making them. The village was unraveling. Some claimed the boy was chosen by God. They insisted his language was divine, a glimpse into a holy truth forgotten by time. They gathered near him, listening closely, repeating fragments of the forbidden language under their breath. Others accused him of being a vessel of the devil. They begged Father Matthew to exorcise him, to cast out whatever spirit had taken hold. But the priest was no longer their guide. He was falling into his own obsession. His journal became darker, filled not with scripture, but with frantic notes about the boy's words. He recorded phonetics, transcribed symbols, and confessed that he was beginning to understand fragments. In one entry, he wrote, "The words cling to me. When I speak them, I feel stronger. When I dream them, I wake with fear. And yet, I cannot stop." The boy himself seemed caught between worlds. Some days he wandered the marshes in silence, as though listening to voices no one else could hear. Other days, he spoke with strange authority, commanding even adults to listen. His frail body seemed too small for the weight of the voice that poured through him. His eyes grew darker, his gaze more distant. One witness claimed, "When he looked at me, I felt as though he could see everything, every secret, every sin. I wanted to run, but I could not move." It was around this time that post-mortem photography became entangled with his story. Though the practice was still rare, whispers spread of photographs taken in secret, images of the boy sitting silently among the dead. One photograph, long lost but described in chilling detail, allegedly showed the boy at the bedside of a vanished child. His eyes were open, his mouth slightly parted, as though mid-word. The corpse beside him was dressed in Sunday clothes, but its lips, too, seemed to curve as though forming the same impossible syllables. The obsession spread further. Some villagers followed him at night, watching as he traced his strange symbols into the mud. They returned home trembling, unable to explain what they had seen. Others begged him to speak blessings over their homes, leaving offerings at his family's door. But with every whispered prayer and every fearful offering, the village fell deeper into the boy's shadow. They had stopped asking who he was. They had stopped asking why he spoke. Now, they only wanted to know what he might do next. Fear had turned to obsession. Obsession had turned to devotion. And devotion, mixed with terror, is a dangerous thing. The boy was no longer just a child. He was becoming something else, a figure of mystery, a vessel of fear, a mirror of their darkest hopes and deepest dread. And as the autumn nights grew colder, the villagers would soon learn that obsession had a price. The church had always been the center of the village. Its bells tolled for births, marriages, and deaths. Its walls offered comfort against storms and sorrow. But in 1821, the church itself became infected with fear. And at the heart of that infection was not the boy, but the priest who could no longer look away. Father Matthew was once regarded as a man of unwavering faith, yet the boy's strange language had shaken him. He told his congregation to resist temptation, to treat the words as a trick of the devil. But secretly, he could not stop listening. By candlelight, he began his investigation. Every time the boy spoke, Matthew wrote. He filled his journal with symbols, phonetics, half-formed translations. His handwriting grew frantic, letters pressed so hard they tore the parchment. The priest described the words as shadows clothed in sound. At first, he resisted repeating them. He believed the syllables themselves carried danger. But one night, alone in the rectory, he whispered a single phrase to himself. He recorded the moment in his journal. The air grew heavy. My candle dimmed. And yet my heart swelled, as if I had spoken the first language of the world. From that night on, he was no longer an investigator. He was a participant. Strange things began to happen inside the church. Villagers swore they saw flickering shapes in the stained glass windows at night, figures that did not belong to any saint. Others said they heard whispers in the empty pews, syllables that echoed the boy's forbidden tongue. Look closely at an old photograph of the church taken years later. At first glance, it shows nothing unusual. The altar, the cross, the flicker of candlelight. But behind the pulpit, faint and shadowed, there appears to be a figure crouched low, its hands covering its mouth as if whispering secrets into the air. Some dismiss it as smoke damage. Others believe it to be proof that the language had left its mark on the holy place. The priest's sermons began to change. No longer did he speak of the familiar gospel. Instead, his homilies became cryptic, laced with fragments of the forbidden language. The congregation shifted uncomfortably as he preached, their eyes darting to the doors, their hearts pounding with unease. One villager later recalled, "He was not preaching to us. He was preaching to something unseen, something that listened from the shadows." Matthew's obsession drove him deeper into the village's forgotten past. He unearthed old records, parish notes that spoke of vanished children, names and dates that had never been explained. Some bore eerie similarities to the boy. Children who spoke strange words, who were found wandering alone, or who vanished into the woods never to be seen again. The priest began to believe that the boy was not unique. He was part of something older, something that had resurfaced across generations like a recurring nightmare. He scrawled one chilling phrase in the margins of his journal. The language is older than us, older than the church, older than God. His investigation grew dangerous. Villagers saw him wandering at night with a lantern, following the boy at a distance. He collected soil from the places where the boy walked. He copied the symbols carved into trees and scratched them into the pages of his Bible. Some nights, they swore they saw him kneeling outside the boy's home, muttering in the forbidden tongue. The priest was no longer their guide. He was a man unraveling, haunted not by demons, but by his own need to understand. One of the most chilling details of his investigation survives in the form of a disturbing drawing from his journal. It depicts the boy standing in the church, his mouth open wide as though speaking. Around him, strange shapes twist and coil, letters that do not belong to any known alphabet. And in the margins, Matthew wrote, "The shadows answered him." The line between faith and madness was collapsing. The priest had once warned the village that the boy's words were poison. Now he clung to them, repeating them endlessly, chasing their meaning through sleepless nights. His eyes grew hollow, his voice cracked. Parishioners began to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him approach. And yet, they could not completely turn away. Because even in his unraveling, there was something mesmerizing about him. His sermons, though terrifying, drew people in. His eyes, though sunken, seemed to burn with unnatural fire. The people who had once placed their faith in God were now placing it in a priest who was losing his soul. The boy remained silent during these days, watching with that same dark intensity. Some claimed he smiled when he heard the priest repeat his words, as though amused by the man's slow corruption. Others swore they saw the boy whisper into the shadows, and that the priest answered as if in conversation. Father Matthew had become more than a witness. He was now entangled in the mystery, a living thread in a tapestry woven by something beyond comprehension. And as the days grew colder, it became clear. The priest's investigation would not bring answers. It would only lead him deeper into the dark. The year was waning. The once bright fields had withered under the chill of late autumn. And with the lengthening nights came whispers that the boy was no longer confined to daylight. The village was changing. People locked their doors earlier. Candles burned later, and every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. What happened in the dark was whispered about in hushed voices, though no one dared to speak it too loudly. For in 1821, the village began to fear the night itself. It started with sounds. At first, they were faint, like branches tapping against windows, or the creak of old timbers in the wind. But soon, villagers began to hear something more. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing outside their homes long after midnight. Some swore they heard whispers with those steps. Not in French. Not in Latin. Not in any tongue they knew. It was the same forbidden language the boy spoke, rolling through the dark like a secret that wanted to be heard. One farmer's wife claimed she woke to find her infant crying, and through the thin wall, she heard a child's voice answering the wail. A child's voice that was not her own. Look closely at a surviving old photograph from that year. At first glance, it shows the dark outline of cottages under a full moon. But along one roof, faint and blurred, there appears to be the silhouette of a small figure, standing perfectly still, staring down at the camera's lens. To this day, some insist it is damage to the plate. Others whisper it was him, the boy who carried the language of shadows. Livestock grew restless. Horses broke free from their stalls, galloping into the night as though chased by unseen figures. Dogs whimpered, refusing to enter certain rooms. Chickens were found dead without wounds, their bodies twisted as though strangled by invisible hands. And then came the symbols, carved into doors, etched into stone, drawn into the dirt outside windows. Always the same, shapes that matched the boy's strange markings, shapes the priest had obsessively copied into his journal. The villagers began to believe the boy's words were more than sound. They were a contagion, a curse that seeped into wood and earth, spreading through the village like an unseen plague. Children, too, began to change. One little girl was found sitting in the road at dawn, rocking back and forth, muttering syllables that no one understood. Her parents swore she had never heard the boy speak. And yet, when Father Matthew asked her to repeat the words, she did so flawlessly. Another child vanished for an entire night, only to be found at sunrise, standing in the churchyard barefoot and shivering. When asked where he had gone, he only answered, "The boy called me." The priest's journal from this time is filled with frantic notes, more unhinged than ever. He described the language spreading like fire, catching in the minds of children, in the dreams of men, in the cries of women at night. One chilling entry reads, "It is not a tongue, it is a sickness, and yet I cannot resist its sound. I wait for it in the night." The villagers grew desperate. They tried salt at their thresholds, crucifixes over their doors, prayers recited until their voices cracked. But nothing stopped the nightly disturbances. Some claimed they saw the boy himself wandering the streets in silence, his thin figure drifting between houses, his bare feet leaving no tracks in the frost. Others said they saw not one boy, but many figures of children moving through the fields at night, all whispering in unison. The lines between reality and nightmare were dissolving. Perhaps the most disturbing image connected to these nights comes from a post-mortem photograph said to have been taken in secret. The image, long rumored but rarely seen, supposedly showed a small coffin opened in a candlelit room. Inside lay the body of a vanished child, dressed in Sunday clothes. And at the edge of the frame, blurred but unmistakable, stood another child, his eyes open wide, his lips slightly parted as if speaking. Some insist it was the boy. Others deny it exists at all. Every night grew worse. Families huddled together in fear, listening for the footsteps outside, for the soft murmur of a language that had no name. The boy's presence no longer felt confined to his body. It was everywhere, woven into the air, stitched into the silence, hidden in the pauses between heartbeats. And when villagers closed their eyes, they began to dream in the forbidden tongue. They woke trembling, unable to recall the words, yet knowing with certainty that they had spoken them aloud in their sleep. The priest was consumed. He roamed the village at night, chasing shadows, desperate to hear the language again. The people no longer trusted him, no longer saw him as their guide. But even in their terror, they knew he was the only one still daring to face the boy directly. Fear had turned the village against itself. Suspicion ran wild. Families accused one another of consorting with the boy. Neighbors watched neighbors, terrified of who might be next to hear the whispers in the dark. And still, the nights grew longer. The sounds grew louder. The shadows grew darker. Until one night, something happened that no villager would ever forget. The village had lived in fear for months. Fear of the boy. Fear of the language. Fear of the nights that whispered with voices no one should understand. But fear has a way of spreading. And soon, the story of the boy was no longer confined to the village's crumbling cottages. It slipped beyond its borders, passed along trade routes, whispered in taverns, carried in letters. By the winter of 1821, strangers began to arrive. Outsiders, men who claimed they could help, men who claimed they could explain. The first were scholars, linguists, and antiquarians drawn by tales of a child who spoke a forbidden language. They carried notebooks, ink, and questions. To them, the boy was not a curse but a treasure, a living key to a past older than scripture itself. They spoke of proto-languages, ancient tongues lost in time, whispers of civilizations erased by history. Some even compared the boy to biblical figures, children chosen to carry the voice of God. Yet when they heard him speak, their confident theories crumbled. One wrote in his diary, "It is not the language of man. It is not the language of angels. It is something else entirely, and it should not exist." Soon after came the opportunists. Traveling performers, collectors, and charlatans who smelled profit in the village's suffering. They offered coin to see the boy, demanded he be displayed like a sideshow. His family refused, but coins found their way into other hands. And so, in dim candlelit rooms, the boy was forced to speak for outsiders, his words scratching at the walls, his voice filling the air with something no one could endure for long. One scholar described it as the sound of memory itself decaying. Another, more disturbed, claimed his ears rang for weeks, as if the boy's words had carved themselves into his skull. Look closely at an old photograph taken during this time. At first glance, it seems ordinary. A group of scholars seated stiffly in their travel coats, their faces pale with exhaustion. But in the corner, half hidden in the shadows, sits a small figure. His face is blurred, his eyes dark pools that seem to follow the viewer. Some say it was the boy, captured unwillingly. Others insist it was something else, an echo, a shadow given form. The villagers, already torn apart by fear, now grew resentful of the outsiders. They accused one another of selling secrets, of betraying the boy to strangers who sought only knowledge or gold. The village's fragile unity splintered further, suspicion spreading like rot. Meanwhile, the priest's obsession deepened. Father Matthew clashed with the scholars, denouncing them as blasphemers. Yet in private, he begged them to share their notes, desperate to understand the fragments of the language he thought he was beginning to grasp. His journal from this time is scattered with contradictions, condemning the outsiders while echoing their theories in his own hand. Among the outsiders was one figure who would leave the deepest scar. A photographer, traveling with heavy equipment and glass plates, drawn by the promise of capturing what words could not. He insisted that if the boy truly carried a forbidden tongue, then an image might reveal what ears could not bear. His photographs, few survive, are the most disturbing images linked to the boy. One shows the child seated in a wooden chair, eyes half closed, lips slightly parted. At first glance, it seems harmless. But behind him, along the wall, dark shapes twist and writhe, not shadows, not reflections. Shapes that resemble letters, but not of any known alphabet, symbols coiling as if alive. Another, more unsettling still, allegedly showed the boy surrounded by the village's children, their faces vacant, their eyes unfocused, as though listening to something just beyond the frame. None of those children would later recall posing for the picture. The outsiders did not stay long. Most left in silence, shaken by what they had seen, their notebooks filled with half-finished thoughts and trembling lines. Some vanished altogether, never returning to their universities or homes. A few stayed, lingering in the village, wandering the streets at night as if under a spell. The villagers whispered that the language had claimed them too, that it had traveled with them, carried like a sickness in the blood, like a fire in the mind. But with the outsiders came more attention, and with attention came danger. The boy was no longer only the village's burden. He had become an object of fascination for the world beyond. And fascination, when mixed with fear, can become deadly. The villagers sensed it. Their nights were no longer haunted only by footsteps and whispers, but by the knowledge that strangers were watching them, probing their lives, seeking a truth better left buried. And then, as winter deepened, the village suffered a blow that none could ignore. The child, one of their own, vanished without trace. Some blamed the boy. Some blamed the outsiders. Others whispered that both were guilty, threads of the same curse. What remained certain was this: the boy's presence had spread far beyond the walls of his family's home. And now, forces greater than the village itself were closing in. By the first weeks of winter, the village was no longer a village. It was a cage. Every door was barred. Every candle burned until the wax was gone. And every whisper in the dark carried the weight of suspicion, fear, and hate. The boy had become more than a mystery. He was a wound, festering in the heart of the community. And wounds left untreated will always rot. The vanished child was the final spark. When dawn came and the girl did not return, the village was thrown into chaos. Families gathered in the square, their voices sharp, their eyes filled with panic. Some swore they saw the boy near the churchyard the night before. Others insisted the outsiders had stolen her away. No one agreed, but everyone needed someone to blame. All eyes turned to the boy. Look closely at one disturbing photograph said to survive from that week. It shows the villagers standing in the snow, their faces blurred in motion. But in the center, faint yet undeniable, is the boy. His face is sharp, too sharp, his eyes black pools staring at the camera. His lips are parted, as if speaking. And some claim that if you stare long enough, the faint trace of symbols appears in the frost behind him, symbols that match those carved into the doors of the homes. The image is almost too unsettling to be coincidence. The nights grew unbearable. The whispers grew louder, closer. Families claimed to hear the vanished child's voice echoing from the fields, always repeating the same syllables the boy had spoken. Dogs howled at nothing, horses refused to move, and children woke screaming in languages they had never learned. The priest, hollow-eyed and trembling, insisted this was proof that the boy's language was not of God, nor of man, but of something older, something that used the living and the dead alike as vessels. His sermons turned to frantic warnings, urging the villagers to cut out the root before the rot consumes us all. And in the crowd, some began to nod. Fear became violence. It began with stones hurled at the boy's window. Then doors slammed in his face. Then offerings replaced by curses. His family was no longer pitied. They were despised, marked as accomplices in whatever curse had fallen upon the land. One night, a group of men gathered outside his home, carrying torches. They demanded the boy be given over. His mother screamed. His father tried to fight. But in the end, the boy simply stepped into the cold, barefoot, his face expressionless. The men swore he smiled at them. The outsiders argued fiercely. Some begged the villagers not to harm him, warning that his death would only deepen the curse. Others, more superstitious, said the boy must be destroyed to end the suffering. The priest said nothing. He only stared at the child, clutching his journal so tightly the leather cracked. That night, the villagers gathered in the church, desperate for guidance. The air was heavy with smoke from too many candles, the pews packed with trembling families. And there, before the altar, the boy was brought forward. He did not resist. He simply stood, staring at the crucifix above, lips moving soundlessly. Some claimed he was praying. Others swore he was reciting the forbidden tongue, speaking directly to the shadows that clung to the rafters. Father Matthew raised his hands to silence the crowd. His voice shook as he declared, This language is not ours. This boy is not ours. And if we do nothing, none of us will remain. The church erupted in chaos, shouts, sobs, prayers overlapping in a storm of panic. And then the boy spoke, not a whisper, not a mutter, but a voice that filled the church, rattling the glass in its frames, shaking the candles until wax spilled across the floor. The language poured from him in a torrent, syllables sharp and heavy, as though each carried the weight of centuries. The villagers fell to their knees, clutching their ears. Some cried. Some screamed. Some repeated his words unconsciously, their mouths moving in time with his. The priest dropped his journal. He stared at the boy with a look of awe and terror combined, for in that moment, he understood more than he ever wished to. He later wrote, in his final coherent entry, "I have seen the beginning and the end, both in the mouth of a child." When the boy finally fell silent, the church was broken. The villagers staggered to their feet, pale, trembling, their eyes filled with horror. Some swore they saw shadows lingering at the altar, shapes that faded only when the last candle went out. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The village had reached its breaking point. They knew what had to be done, not because they wanted to, but because they could no longer bear to live with the boy among them. And before the winter was done, they would act. Winter deepened. Snow weighed heavy on the roofs, the fields frozen, the trees standing like black skeletons against the sky. But the cold was nothing compared to the frost that clung to the hearts of the villagers. They had made their choice. The boy could not remain. No one agrees on what happened that final night. Some say he was taken into the woods, where the trees swallowed his cries. Others insist he was locked away beneath the church, his voice silenced behind stone and prayer. A few claim he simply vanished, gone with the snow, leaving only footprints that ended in the middle of the frozen fields. What is certain is this: after that winter, the boy was never seen again. The priest's journal ended abruptly. His final words, written in a shaking hand, read only, "We silenced him." But the words remain. He was found weeks later, slumped over his desk, the ink frozen in his well, his mouth still open as if mid-prayer. Yet those who saw him swore it was not a prayer on his lips. It was the boy's forbidden language. The outsiders, those who had lingered, left quickly in the wake of the boy's disappearance. Some carried their notebooks and photographs away, but many of those artifacts were later lost, destroyed, or hidden in private collections. A few images survive, though most are debated as hoaxes. One of the most unsettling shows an empty wooden chair in the snow. At first glance, it seems harmless. But if you look closely, faint markings cover the seat, symbols carved into the wood, identical to those the boy once scrawled in the dirt. The photo has been called many things: proof, a fraud, an accident. But those who study it insist the markings were burned into the chair, not carved. The village itself changed forever. Families moved away. Fields were left to rot. The church, once a beacon, became a husk of silence. By the time outsiders returned decades later, the settlement was a ghost of itself, an unsettling history written in abandoned homes and overgrown graveyards. And always, in the stories that lingered, the boy remained. Parents warned their children, "Do not wander at night. Do not listen to voices in the dark. Do not answer if you hear your name whispered by someone unseen." For it was said the boy still walked the fields, barefoot, whispering in a language that shouldn't exist. Some swore that if you listened too closely, you would understand him. And once you understood, you would never be free again. Even today, researchers debate his story. Was it hysteria born from isolation and superstition? A child's strange illness twisted into legend? Or was it something older, something hidden in the cracks of time, an echo of a language lost before history itself began? No answer has ever been found. But in the world of dark history, horror storytelling, and unsolved mysteries, the boy's legend remains one of the most haunting. Because language is power. It carries memory, shapes belief, binds people to past and future. And what happens when a child speaks not a language of the past, but a language that should never have existed at all. So the story ends where it began. In silence, the boy is gone. The village is gone. And yet the words remain, scattered in journals, whispered in forgotten tales, buried in disturbing images that surface from time to time. Perhaps you believe it was nothing more than folklore, another shadow born from fear. Or perhaps you believe, as some do, that the boy was a vessel, that he spoke for something hidden, something waiting. The next time you hear a whisper in the dark, words you cannot understand, do not answer. Do not listen too closely, because once you recognize the sound, it may already be too late. The boy is gone, but the language is not.